So what I want to do now is I want to make some clarifications. And the reason why I want to make some clarifications is because when I discuss the idea of genocide with people, and I ask them, hey, what do you think genocide is? Or you would ask someone what genocide is, or is the idea of genocide interchangeable with any other ideas? What you'll invariably hear is that, well, genocide it's like a war crime, right? Or it's like a crime against humanity. Genocide is an act of mass murder. Genocide is this, genocide is that, so on and so forth. And what I'm going to do for the point of clarification is to make very clear demarcations between these concepts, right? Because especially in an academic analysis of genocide, it's important that we have sort of these distinctions between terms, right? It's very, very important to make sure that our terms represent the ideas that we want to convey, right? Because the worst thing that you can do is make an equivocation in terms. Say the word mass murder when I really mean genocide. Say the word genocide when I really mean mass murder, right? They're two different terms for two different, entirely different concepts. So what I'm going to do now, and I've just arbitrarily, not really arbitrarily, but I've, on my own account, put together what I think most of the conflation, 5 terms where I think it's 5 terms, yeah, 5 terms where I believe most of the conflation arises, and I'm going to try and make distinctions in the lexicon, right, so that we have a clear understanding of what we mean when we use these terms as average everyday folk. Okay, so number 1 is crimes, C-R-I, crimes against humanity. And I'll abbreviate it from now on CAH, right? Crimes against humanity, I'll abbreviate as CAH. Okay, so by crimes against humanity, what do we mean by crimes against humanity? Well, the first thing to recognize is that anytime we're talking about crimes against humanity, we're specifically saying that these crimes have been willfully directed towards civilians, right? Civilian population. To be technical, non-combatant population. So I'll write that down. Okay. When we're talking about crimes against humanity, we're saying that these crimes that are directed toward civilians. Right? Crimes that are directed towards civilians. Technically speaking, when we're talking about civilians, we mean non-combatants. Right. I did a video earlier. It's on just war theory. I forget which number of the videos. It's like a 7 or 8 part series on just war theory. The idea of crimes against humanity sort of interplays with this idea of just war theory, because one of the foundational accounts in just war theory for sort of a justice in wartime, you know, conduct within war, pertains to non-combatant immunity, right? So you cannot, non-combatants are immune from the war, right? You should not directly target those who are not participants in the war. You know, military personnel are fair game, but you can't directly target non-combatants. So for example, what happened in Pearl Harbor, where Japanese fighter pilots specifically bombed and attacked the United States, including, you know, both a naval base, but also civilian populations. What happened in 9/11, where civilians were specifically targeted, though there were, you know, military personnel in the building, obviously, but civilians were specifically targeted, would be considered a war crime, right? Because it was an intentional use of military force against non-combatant civilian population, right, which is expressly prohibited. Also, this idea of crimes against humanity may be state endorsed, right, or state sponsored targeting of non-combatant civilian populations, right? So, but you get the idea, right? So anytime we're talking about crimes against humanity, we're talking about crimes that are directed towards civilians, which I put down. May also, this idea of crimes against humanity may also refer to state-endorsed persecution of its citizens and civilians, right? So it could be, well, I don't want to jump the gun. So that's the first pass. Okay, number number 2, I think we get the idea. Genocide. And we have an idea of genocide. We just went through and described what genocide is. We talked about how genocide is punished, and so on. Basically, genocide is the intentional destruction of a nation or a group, right? And we talked about that, right? Genocide is the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, right? And then we listed the 5 criteria. So genocide is the intent, right, which is important, right? The intent. Right? The intent to destroy, ... right? The intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. That's the idea of genocide. Now, scholars have tried to make, and done, I think, phenomenal accounts. This is not necessarily my account. This is a hodgepodge of part mine and part theorists from all over this presentation of genocide. But theorists have made distinctions when confronted with the idea of, well, what exactly is the difference between a crime against humanity and an act of genocide? Aren't all acts of genocide equally acts of crime against humanity? Aren't all acts of aren't all crimes against humanity acts of genocide? The answer is no, they're separate. How is it that they're separate? Well, I'm not going to get into sort of the technical aspects of it all, but here's the way that it's been, the distinction has been made by others, and here's the distinction that I'll inform you of. We can think of the distinction with respect to intent, right? Genocide, there is an intent. A crime against humanity is devoid of intent, right? It's devoid of intent. And it's not to say that it's categorically devoid of intent, but we mean the specific intent, right? The specific intent to target, the specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, X, Y, Z, ... Okay. Think of the distinction, argues some, and I would support this conceptualization. Think of the distinction between murder, on the one hand, and premeditated murder. Right? So the argument is, think of the distinction between murder and premeditated murder. Legally, there is a legal distinction between murder and premeditated murder. Premeditated murder is worse than murder, right? The punishment for premeditated murder can be more severe than the punishment for murder. I'll give you a very general example. Man has a concealed weapons permit, has the gun in his blazer. He comes home after a long day's of work, opens the door. Sure enough, there is his wife with man X. The man is just incensed with rage, pulls out his gun, kills man X, right? That's an act of murder. He didn't have the intent of killing that guy when he got home today. He didn't even know that the guy would be there sleeping with his wife. He comes home, he happened to have an instrument of death. That sounds bad, right? But he happened to or of defense. But he happened to have a gun in his holster. He sees the guy. Without even thinking about it, he reaches for his gun and kills the guy in just a fit of rage, right? No premeditation. Guy, different example, guy leaves work knowing that he'll come home and kill knowing that his wife is cheating on him. Waits, lets the lover come into the house, sees the lover go into the house, tracks the lover, has been tracking the lover for a while, comes into the house, gun already in hand, drawn, kicks open the door, sure enough, verifies the fact what he'd been looking for all along, and premeditated and kills the person, right? Different crime, same result. Guy dies, man kills guy. Difference, right? The difference is one of murder and premeditation. It's, I think, a good way of making the conceptual distinction between a crime against humanity and an act of genocide. In a few minutes, I'll give you examples of the distinction between crimes against humanity and acts of genocide. Right now, I'm not. The most important thing to recognize on a very, very sort of introductory level is that crimes against humanity, for the most part, lack or are devoid of intentionality. Genocide necessarily has to have intent, right? And a very specific type of intent. Specific intent. Okay, so now we understand sort of the distinction between a crime against humanity and an act of genocide.